The air in New York City was thick with coal dust and ambition, an invisible current that clung to skin and whispered of both ruin and riches. It was 1881, and the streets rattled under horse-drawn carriages, their drivers exchanging curses as they weaved around peddlers, hawking apples and newspapers. Towering above them all were the granite facades of Wall Street, where men in tailored suits essentially bartered the nation's future. Their deals filled an America still stitching itself back together after a war that had all but torn it apart. Among these crowded streets walked Joseph Reed, his polished shoes tapping with carefully timed purpose, eyes sharp beneath the brim of a borrowed hat. To the world, he was a servant, quiet, deferential, and easily dismissed. Yet Joseph carried a secret heavier than any bank ledger, one with the power to topple empires or build one of his own. He had learned early that survival meant seeing what others overlooked. Growing up in the shadow of a Georgian plantation, Joseph watched his mother, Lila, sew delicate hems for the planter's wife. More importantly, he saw her hide messages for runaways in the fabric's folds. By candlelight, her gentle finger traced words in a stolen Bible, teaching him to read. "Knowledge is a blade," she said. "Use it silently, and you can cut through any chain." When freedom came, it arrived as something Joseph had to seize, not something handed over. He fought his way north, trading the cotton fields for city shadows. By 25, he had a position in the Madison Avenue mansion of Junius Spencer Morgan, patriarch of a banking dynasty, with a name whispered as both prayer and curse. The Morgan Mansion was a fortress of mahogany and gilt trim, its chandeliers casting light on portraits of stern-faced men who had built fortunes on railroads and steel. Joseph passed through these rooms like a ghost, quietly serving coffee to Junius and his son, John Pierpont, JP. The world would soon learn to call him. Their conversations, thick with talk of markets and mergers, were tinged with the confidence of men who seemed to own time itself. Joseph poured their drinks with a steady hand, listening intently. He had studied their language, initially from scraps of old newspapers and secondhand bits of overheard deals, and soon recognized that true power did not lie in gold or bonds alone, but in the unseen gaps between them, spaces a determined man could exploit. It began, innocently enough, with a mistake. Late one evening, while clearing the study, Joseph discovered a ledger left open on Junius's desk. It contained rows of numbers detailing a souring investment, a railroad company on the brink of collapse, its shares deemed worthless. A single scribbled line read, "Sell at loss." Joseph felt his pulse hammer. He had heard the family speak about bottom fishing, quietly buying cheap when others panicked. He had no capital of his own, but he did have nerve and time. The next morning, he spent a week's wages to send a coded telegraph to an acquaintance in Philadelphia, a one-time porter who now ran a modest pawn shop and trusted Joseph's instincts. "Buy low," the message said. Joseph signed with a false name, leaving no trail. Months later, when the railroad's stock rebounded, the profits were modest but real. For Joseph, that was all he needed to plant a seed. He became a collector of secrets. It wasn't only Morgan business he spied upon. It was everything that seeped out of the walls. Senators, industrialists, and men of influence strutted through the mansion's corridors, talking too freely once the brandy flowed. Joseph listened, memorizing, and afterward recorded names, numbers, and clues in a journal stashed beneath a loose attic floorboard. By day, he was the perfect servant, head bowed, footsteps soft, but at night, he pored over stock tables and market notices, learning to read the pulse of every boom and bust. he cultivated a clandestine network of butlers, chambermaids, and stable hands, those overlooked by men who never imagined that the help might be paying attention. Through these contacts, Joseph pieced together deals in real estate, shipping, and expansion plans for Wells Fargo. Each day brought him another scrap of knowledge he stitched into a tapestry of opportunity. The game he played was perilous. Being a black man in 1881 meant that one misstep could spiral into disaster. Nothing about his trades could ever be traced back to him. No banker would accept such a notion. So, Joseph used white proxies, men he aided in subtle ways, so they would put stocks in their names, never suspecting that Joseph was orchestrating it all. As he refined his methods, he followed the market's cyclical rhythms. When Wells Fargo expanded stagecoach lines, he slipped instructions to his intermediaries to invest. When those bets returned a profit, he reinvested, adding railroads, banks, and bonds, building his shadow portfolio with unwavering patience. All the while, he stayed invisible to the Morgans, content to polish their silver and pour their coffee. From year to year, his fortune grew in secret. By 1884, he was turning a respectable profit from diverse holdings, enough to purchase a modest house in Harlem using a false name. Despite his progress, he remained tethered to the mansion on Madison Avenue. That vantage point was crucial to his success, its rooms still brimming with overheard whispers of nationwide deals. Meanwhile, the Morgan empire grew just as rapidly, led more and more by J.P., whose hunger for dominance rivaled Joseph's own, but who had no need for secrecy. J.P. Morgan was brash, celebrating conquest with public flair. Joseph watched from a careful distance, seeing J.P.'s flair as a vulnerability. Where J.P. reveled in fame, Joseph cultivated anonymity. As J.P. gained influence, the Morgans began risking colossal sums on steel mills and railroad expansions. Joseph tracked every rumor of a shaky investment. One day, while serving drinks, he sensed tension between Junius and J.P. over a failing Pennsylvania steel mill. Junius warned that the project was on the brink. J.P. refused to hear it. Joseph investigated quietly. Machinery was outdated, workers unpaid, the enterprise was drowning. Sensing opportunity, he shorted the mill's bonds through a trusted proxy. When the mill went under, Joseph's profit was substantial, enough to reinvest in ventures that spanned from shipping lines in Boston to a Chicago bank. Later, J.P. fumed about vultures who had gained from his misfortune. Joseph kept his composure, pouring whiskey for a man who had no idea the vulture stood right beside him. Wealth alone was not Joseph's endgame. He had begun craving leverage, the power to steer fortunes and shape the destiny of those who would never suspect his hand. Subtly, he started eyeing the Morgan Bank itself. He studied its shareholders, hunting for weaknesses among those who might sell their stakes. Junius, aging and ailing, worried J.P. might gamble too recklessly. Joseph focused on shareholders with debts or discontent. In time, he found a ripe target, a minor stakeholder named Hargrove, a widower drowning in debt from a failing textile business. Joseph, always working through proxies, arranged for Hargrove to sell his Morgan shares, never suspecting he was dealing with the very servant who topped off his wine. It was just a sliver of the bank, but a wedge was all Joseph needed. Electric lights began replacing gas lamps. Skyscrapers reached for the sky. By 1887, Joseph was more than a distant investor. He was weaving himself into the financial fabric of New York, using his vantage point in the Morgan household as both cover and information pipeline. Yet this lonely double life weighed on him. He told no one until he met Clara, a cook at a nearby estate. They crossed paths at a church social in Harlem, where her laughter and grace intrigued him. Afraid of betrayal, he revealed only fragments of his life's secrets. Though she sensed his guarded nature, she asked no questions he wasn't ready to answer. "You carry so much alone," she once told him, her words warming the chill around his heart. Slowly, trust grew between them. Even as his personal life blossomed, Joseph's schemes grew bolder. JP now dreamed of a great trust, a network of companies that would strangle competition in steel, coal, and shipping. Joseph saw cracks in that plan, though. He fed subtle rumors to competing industrialists, undercutting JP's deals enough to nudge stock prices lower. He then quietly bought shares through proxies as panic flared. Again, his piece of the Morgan empire increased. JP, meanwhile, took out his frustrations on anyone within range, cursing those faceless enemies who were profiting while he stumbled. Joseph watched it all from the sidelines, feigning innocence behind a respectful bow. But there were eyes on him now. One night, Joseph discovered a confidential letter on JP's desk. A detective had been tasked with uncovering who was buying up Morgan shares in covert chunks. Joseph replaced it carefully, heart hammering. His precautions had been thorough, but no plan was flawless. He doubled his caution, opening new channels to launder money, burning old notes, and using fresh proxies. Clara sensed his anxiety. "Whatever storm you're facing, we face it together," she insisted. Yet Joseph couldn't bring himself to confess how deep his deceptions ran. He still believed in his ultimate objective, to break the system that had once enslaved him by wielding its own weapons against it. He pressed forward. By 1890, Joseph's hidden empire rivaled the portfolios of men the newspapers lauded as titans. He concealed his identity through labyrinthine cutouts and proxies. The shares he held in Morgan operations were enough to shift board votes if ever revealed. And the detective lingered, but found no single thread leading to Joseph. Still, JP, increasingly paranoid, scrutinized everyone around him. One morning, JP cornered Joseph, remarking, "You're always here, Reed. You see everything. Makes you wonder, doesn't it?" Joseph smiled politely. "I only serve, sir." Yet beneath that calm mask, he felt a tightening coil of dread. Clara, more entangled in his life, sensed his isolation. She urged him to trust her, to share his burdens fully. Bit by bit, Joseph told her of his youth, his struggle to learn letters by candlelight, and his vow to never be powerless again. He omitted the finer details of stocks and conspiracies, but she understood enough. They married quietly, building a small home. Even so, Joseph could not pause his pursuit. JP's trust ambitions grew more extreme. Seeing a chance, Joseph intentionally fed explosive information to one of JP's rivals, Andrew Carnegie's people, who used it to sabotage Morgan's steel interests. As panic spread, Joseph bought up distressed shares. His stakes swelled, but so did the detective's interest in the phantom buyer. Joseph feared the day his name would be discovered. One evening, he ducked the detective's men following him down a Harlem alleyway, heart hammering at the close call. He warned Clara to flee the city if anything happened to him. She refused, tears in her eyes. "If I leave, we both lose." He realized then that no matter his caution, he was endangering the woman he loved. But turning back felt impossible. By 1893, as the nation veered toward financial panic, Joseph sensed the final gambit approaching. Banks were failing left and right. JP tried to play savior with the trust he'd built, needing immense capital to shore up the markets. Joseph sold off assets at their peak, amassing cash, then waited for Morgan's stock to drop, knowing panic would make them cheap. He bought aggressively, weaving his way to a share of the bank rumored to exceed a fifth. It made him, if discovered, a silent kingmaker. The detective only grew bolder. Joseph scoured his proxies, ridding himself of any that might be compromised. He felt a familiar knot in his stomach, a dual fear and exhilaration. Clara begged him to think of a simpler life. Joseph resisted, explaining that if he stopped now, All they had built could vanish if the Morgans suspected betrayal. Only one more move, he told himself. A railroad merger JP yearned for to stabilize his trust. Joseph leaked details to Morgan's rivals, stoking their own bids and forcing JP's hand. When the rails tumbled, Joseph scooped them up cheaply. The takeover soared, and Joseph's final profit was immense. Afterward, he sold half of his Morgan shares secretly, funneling the money into schools and churches that served the black community. He kept the rest, enough to secure a hidden vote in Morgan affairs. In 1895, a hint of truth dawned on the detective. Without concrete proof, he leveled suspicions at Joseph. Summoned to JP's study, Joseph listened as the industrialist ranted about phantom traders undermining the bank. He poured brandy calmly, expression schooled. JP tried to read him, but found only the practiced neutrality of a devoted servant. Eventually, JP fell silent, dismissing him with a wave. The detective had failed to unmask him. That night, Joseph and Clara left the mansion for good, their bags already packed. They traveled to Chicago, adopting a quiet new life under a fresh identity. If Harlem folks whispered rumors of a man who had bested the Morgans, they had no proof. In Chicago, Joseph lived modestly. He no longer needed grandiose gestures or infiltration. While J.P. Morgan's name towered in the headlines, Joseph's shares still cast a subtle shadow, a gentle nudge on future votes through his proxies. He funneled profits into community building, banks that served black neighborhoods, newspapers that spoke for the voiceless. When J.P. died in 1913, eulogized as a titan, Joseph read the tributes calmly. Clara squeezed his hand. They never knew. He nodded, accepting the price of his secrecy. Victory for Joseph was invisible. Their children heard bedtime stories not of stock deals, but of a clever boy who learned to notice what others missed. A boy who refused to be broken by the chains into which he was born. Joseph died in 1920, his coffin flanked by neighbors who knew he had once worn a servant's uniform. None guessed at the hidden empire he had built in silence. Clara kept his secrets safe, smiling through tears at a legacy forged in the shadows. The Morgan dynasty never learned who had held their fate in hand, and that Joseph would have said was triumph enough